Hi, my name is Shelby Abbott, and I am here with John Wilson on the Nehemiah Way Podcast. I'm very excited to be here with him today because we're going to talk about this book with him. He is one of the authors of the Nehemiah Way. We're going to talk a little bit about the nature of the book, where it came from, the ideas, some of the content within it.
The book of Nehemiah is such a powerful resource, and especially if you don't just do the quick read, like really dig into what it's saying. There's so much symbolism and spiritual development and discipleship to be had there.
But make sure that you stay until the end because we're going to talk about 4 different practical steps that you can take to get started at mobilizing volunteer leaders for your church.
There's also just a very, very practical guide to how you can mobilize volunteer leaders in your church.
If you're a pastor and you see something like, another leadership book, I want to encourage you to stick around because this is going to be maybe different than what you've experienced before. The subtitle of the Nehemiah Way is Mobilize, a Church Full of Leaders. So this is not all on you as the pastor. So give me a little bit of maybe, John, an elevator pitch of how you would talk to someone about this book if you were like meeting them for 30 seconds and they were a pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Shelby. Yeah, I think being a pastor is one of the toughest jobs that there is. And when I talk to pastors, I hear so often them saying, I feel really burned out because it just seems like a small group of people are doing most of the work in the church while the majority of people show up and watch us do it. So the Nehemiah Way is really just unpacking the book of Nehemiah that is just a treasure trove of ideas and practical steps you can take to mobilize volunteer leaders, not just volunteers, but volunteer leaders in the church to really shoulder a majority or most of the work of the church in ways that is not typical in churches today.
Yeah, that's a pretty good observation, and I'd say that's happening pretty much carte blanche across the board when it comes to churches, at least in the West. What was your idea for this? Like, what was the genesis of like, I have to write a book about this. I have to make sure that my ideas get out there so that I can help people about it. Is it basically what you just said, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, it was the late 1970s.
So you've been chewing on it for a while.
I've been chewing on it for a while. I was 4. But yeah, I mean, I joke about that, but really, truly, I think at least the original spark is back in that moment. I was asked by my mom to help be part of a little skit that she wanted to do for her neighborhood Bible study. She had, a dozen or more people that came every week to do a Bible study together. And she was launching some time focused on the book of Nehemiah. And she said, hey, I want you to help me act this out. You're going to be a cupbearer. Well, it's like Nehemiah is a cupbearer. There's a king. There's and of course I wanted to be the hero of the story. So I wanted to be Nehemiah. And I'm like, hey, if there's a king, there's got to be a throne. So I'm like, I immediately started tearing the blue cushions off this like really ugly couch, the old couch that we had, and like starting to build a throne. And I got really into it. But I mean, what happened in that moment, I got sensitized really early to this story in the Bible. And it's funny for me now when I realize, like, when I talk to people, a lot of people have even been believers for a long time, haven't read it. I mean, they're usually aware that it's in the Bible, but don't really know the story, don't have a lot of familiarity with it.
Yeah.
And what I saw even then was, here's somebody that's a very like kind of ordinary, maybe even you might describe as a lowly person being used in a powerful way by God. And that was what initially intrigued me by the story.
Yeah. Is it something that you, obviously you started young at the idea of this? Is Nehemiah something that was something that you studied early on in your years of following Jesus? Is it something that you felt like people weren't aware enough of as they were doing their daily Bible readings and that kind of things? And what more can they learn? What have you discovered of what more people can learn from Nehemiah, maybe other than just leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a book I read many times from early on in my time being as a believer and my time studying scripture. But where I really zoomed in on it was, I'd like to say more recently. It's almost 15 years now, but like I really felt very clearly called by God to study, to go and get a PhD and to study the biblical foundations of organizational leadership.
Okay.
And in particular, I kind of focused in on entrepreneurial leadership, which is a little bit of a nuance, but So I went to a school that it was one of the only online PhD programs because I was working full time. I had young kids. And I really felt this real distinct calling, even knowing at the time, I'm not sure what this is for. Like, I don't know where it's going. And so, and, looking back, I always tell people that ask me about, oh, I think I might get a PhD. I'm like, whoo, count the cost. It's really, really expensive. And I'm not talking about tuition. It's just, it's a ton of work. And I don't know that I would have needed to go get a PhD to really dive deeply into the book of Nehemiah, but I did spend a lot of time during that time using a lot of the tools, exegetical tools and, kind of biblical history and biblical literature, and a lot of the tools that I was learning, I was applying to this book in particular because I had that kind of formative interest in the book.
Right.
And as I started to explore, this program was set up where we were studying biblical foundations and we were studying, kind of like contemporary leadership theory as a behavioral science and really blending those together. And so, pretty early on, it just really became evident that a lot of what now is being examined and applied is as contemporary leadership theory, not just Christian leadership, but just across the board. Nehemiah really laid it all out, and
it was
all
like
there. Such a great example. It's all right there.
Yeah.
And so that was really an interesting time to dig into it, not just from an interested, enthusiastic believer reading the Bible or for discipleship, but also for, just that really digging into what are the applications, the implications, and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is something that I knew about a long time ago for me because you and I go to the same church, Brandywine Grace Church in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Okay, so give me a little bit of background of like your thoughts of perhaps even implementing some of these things directly at our church when you're thinking about mobilizing leaders.
Yeah, well, and that's where the study or the story continues a little bit. As I was finishing up my PhD program, it's relatively new to the church. It was a church plant. I came maybe about a year and a half or 2 years after. And, I'd had a chance to get to know the pastors a little bit. And even then, I think they were thinking we're kind of getting to where we're not necessarily a church plant anymore. We're a church.
Yeah.
And they were starting
There's
to
a
think
shift there that happens when from a plant to a more grounded church, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So the three of them were, really thinking about what, how do we, be intentional about strategic planning. I think they were starting to really feel the weight of, all the things that have to be done and doing a lot of it themselves and, not having, a robust support from leaders within the church yet.
Mm-hmm.
There were some, of course. And so they said, hey, we're going to do a kind of a strategic planning weekend. Would you help, bring some of the things that you do with your clients that are, a lot of times entrepreneurs or leaders of nonprofit or social impact organizations, for strategic planning? So I said, sure. I said, I had during my PhD work had started to build a paradigm based on the book of Nehemiah. This feels like a good place to look at that. Do you mind if we kind of do it in a way where we're examining that scripture while we're kind of workshopping this out? And they said, that's great. That's really interesting. So that was really the first time I got to take a lot of just study and research and kind of, I'll call it just analysis and really put it into like, how would this be applied in this situation? And so I put a kind of a 1.5 day long workshop together for the four of us to go through and facilitated that for the weekend. And that was really where, it was just went from being like, there's a lot of content here in the book of Nehemiah to, wow, there is very actionable, applicable, kind of hard practical skills and techniques here, which is, a lot of times we're, I almost get a little uneasy when someone goes into the Bible and says, my leadership theory is perfectly represented here in, in scripture. It's like, well,
okay. Yeah.
And, so what was interesting with this was just unpacking, almost like going through the layers of Nehemiah to say, let's not like say, Nehemiah did this contemporary model. Like, let's look and see what was Nehemiah's model. And it's very, very distinctive. It's very, very clear. And so it was a really cool opportunity to process together where we're almost looking at, okay, how did Nehemiah do this? He's like, he basically got sent by God to go and do this project and getting approval, getting resourced, getting prepared, planning, getting actionable, rallying people. These are all things that are very clearly outlined. And, so it's like, we don't have to like bring our model to the Bible. The Bible already has the model.
Yep. Yeah, I love that. So you did this strategic planning weekend. Was there any more kind of intentional work that you did, maybe with the pastors or even with the congregation?
Yeah, so those are two things that followed, and I will say they didn't follow immediately.
Okay.
There was, I think we had some follow-up meetings after the workshop, and there was, it was almost like this time of, the pastors got together with the elders and just really thought about the strategy and those kinds of things. In fact, that was a period of time where Sarah Greenslade stepped in. She's now the executive director and really, really brought a lot of structure, implemented a lot of things that they were looking at strategically, but bringing that structure to what I would call the church operating system,
Right.
which was pretty amazing. And
Yeah.
but sometime in the year or so after that, the ask was for me, like, would I be an executive coach to the lead pastor? Because this was, kind of moving into new territory. He's someone that had worked as a pastor in a much larger ministry, and then he became a church planner. He became kind of an entrepreneur, or as I like to say, pastors are really like the ultimate accidental entrepreneur. They don't realize they're running an organization business, but they are. And so there was an opportunity for about a year and a half. We met, at least once or twice a month. And just kind of talking through what's it like to, as with entrepreneurs, I always say, how do you get out of the business? How do you like start working on the business instead of in the business?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, so for him, it's like, okay, how do you, set aside time and be intentional about, working on the church rather than in the church, which is, taking a step back and what is vision? What is an operating system that helps us to really be efficient with the resources and that God has asked us to steward, and how do we engage people and how do we organize people? And so some of that was a lot of times what I do with university students, where it's just coaching that one-on-one, like, okay, yeah, here's like techniques, theory, framework, whatever you want to call it. Great, theory is awesome, but how do you turn that into practice, and how do you turn that into skills that are operational? So that was something that we worked with for a long period of time. And then I think the second part you asked about is engaging the congregation. And that even came a few years later yet, when a lot of these things were starting to take hold and that structure was in place with a lot of the work Sarah was doing. The strategy was starting to take, shape. There was a lot of like struggle, internal and external conflict and whatever, like
dealing with sinners. That's right. Yeah.
It's like, so a lot of the things that Nehemiah experienced, you see this playing out. But then there came a point where our executive pastor, Jason, came and said, hey, we would like to, you're really leaning on leadership development. And it's so interesting. Just, I think this was ahead of its time. Like almost every pastor I talk to now, I'll say something like, what's on your mind right now? What's weighing on you? And leadership development, it seems to be the one that comes up the most as the first response to that question.
Okay.
So it was interesting. This was a couple of years ago, maybe several years ago now, where he said, hey, would you do a class, like do kind of what you did with that workshop, but let's do like a 6 or 8 week class. I said, well, and I'm a university professor, and I'm sensitive to the fact that people don't love lectures. So I said, why don't we do it as a workshop? And so he said, well, what's that look like? I said, well, what's a big strategic problem that you should do something about, you don't have bandwidth for? And so he listed several. I said, great, pick the one you like the best, and or what I think we actually ended up doing is presented several of the problems to the group, and they got to pick one. And as we were learning about Nehemiah, as we were learning the Nehemiah way, in a sense, we were also applying immediately, like the group that kind of signed up to learn about leadership and biblical foundations of it, we're also then doing leadership at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really powerful to see. A lot of individuals that were part of the church, even I think every single one of them were partners, as we call them, or members of the church. But none of them at the time really in a specific leadership role. And looking back now, I think almost, if not every single person, almost every person that was in that room is now in a role as a deacon or a ministry leader of some sort, a few years later.
That's really cool to hear that it's actually practically tangibly working amongst the people, which moves from theory to reality. So you were able to experience that and see some of the change implemented not only with the lead pastor and some of the other pastors, but this group of people who came to your workshop. How did you see that mentality of multiple people mobilizing a core group of leaders so that there are multiple leaders in multiple categories? How'd you see that trickle into the average either partner or maybe even attender at Brandywine Grace?
Yeah. So, I mean, the answer I'll give you here, and this is, I feel like, God's always doing a lot of things at once.
Yes.
So I don't want to say, this group of people took this class and it radically changed everything. It's, there were so many things that were in motion, leading into this. And those have continued and grown and expanded since then. But, this group, seeing them energized, I think we're really fueling that that same activity that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what was happening at this time, and I think, you could say this is cause effect or maybe correlation rather than causation. I think the fact that Jason was thinking we should do this leadership development class was, I think some of these things were starting to take shape, and it was a way like, can we accelerate this? But the big thing is, this was a point where the church was really in the middle of making a transition from the pastors and elders were more or less doing all the leading.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about, hey, we want to lead this. It's like, can we get some people to show up and help? And really this, I think, marked, or at least was part of the transition to, there was pretty active effort to recruit volunteers to take on formal leadership roles in the church.
Okay.
Recognizing they're not full-time, they're not paid staff, they're not, it's a little bit different than hiring someone, but this is a very engaged partner or member saying, yeah, I will dedicate, a few hours, maybe 5 or 6 hours a week, for a period of time to not just go and help out, but to actually stand up a ministry, to go through that process of, pray, plan, prepare, and then activate, going through that, that whole process. And then, almost saying like, yeah, like we'll sit down, I'll understand the vision. I'll understand what we're trying to accomplish and the outcomes, and I'll go find the people and I'll get them organized and I'll, put the plan together and, get it checked off and those kinds of things. So that was really the shift that was happening. And I can think of half a dozen different ministries that went from, there were several people that just were leaning in and doing a lot. Oftentimes, really feeling the weight of it, to all of a sudden, it was more like very intentional leadership roles established and people put in place. And it was really the first time the church around that time had created what's called the Book of Church Order. They started to identify the deacon role and really to elevate that. It's not that it didn't exist before, but it was just more like, hey, somebody's like a helper, whereas this was, all of a sudden deacon roles that became ministry lead roles, almost like a director.
Mm-hmm.
And even thinking of, we've had a couple of waves now of, it's not just bringing in a new deacon to replace an old deacon. It's like there were actually expansion roles, as I like to call them, in that space. So it's been really encouraging to see the church grow. And I think there was a moment that I will never forget. It was just, earlier this year, Easter Sunday. I'm walking to the park because our church was putting on a service, not just for our church, but for the entire community. And, we're expecting, usually maybe about 300 people from our church might show up. They're expecting over 600 from the community to come in. And as I'm walking, I bump into the lead pastor, Kenny, and he's, just kind of casually heading over to the park too, about 20 minutes before the service started. And he was preaching that day. And he's like, oh yeah, how's your week? We're chatting. And, it's like, and we get there were more than 100 volunteers involved and engaged in that event, from putting the sound system up outside to, bringing in several hundred chairs, to there were donuts for the adults, and there were, Easter baskets for the kids. And I mean, it was a massive production. And at the same time, almost 100 volunteers, many of them overlapping, had spent the last several months being part of a major renovation to the entire sanctuary to make room for 100 more seats because it was like literally bursting at the seams.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a major construction project going on. You have a major community involvement project going on. You have, 100 to 150 volunteers, and the pastors are, involved, but they're not like, you could see the weight of the world could be on their shoulders, and yet they now have a system in place that's helping that happen. So it was really encouraging to see.
Yeah, beautiful, and a great example too. Yeah, and I remember seeing Candy that morning. It looks pretty relaxed for an Easter morning, Easter Sunday morning. But yeah, that's great to give people a little peek behind the curtain of what happens in a church when something like this is implemented. Can you explain maybe for a person who goes, okay, I read the cover of the book, I read the summary in the back. How is this different from simple delegation of responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I think that can be the, almost the thought of like leadership is really just delegating.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the other thing too is, this is where I think still when you read most Christian leadership books that are out there, you still kind of have an air of a top-down organization that's really, you have pastors, elders, maybe a few, a staff, essentially figuring out what we're going to do, and then it's just delegating the work down to other people. And I think the difference here is ownership. I don't mean like ownership, like, like no longer under the control of the elders or the church or, the pastors or leaders, but, really like, recruiting people, not just to, get a task done, but to really, flesh out what does this aspect of the ministry need to look like to be successful,
Mm-hmm.
Building the plan, building the budget, pitching that, getting the resources, recruiting the people, putting things in place, getting the structure, and it's like in the business world, which I spent over 20 years as I was a senior leader in the technology industry. There are practices about, you structure an organization in a certain way and things do flow down. But, ultimately, if you're a vice president or a director, you're handed a set of objectives and you have to figure out how to leverage the resources you have and structure things and define things in a way that are going to achieve the intended outcomes. And ministry outcomes are a little bit different in principle, but ultimately it's the same thing. It's like, how do you have scarce resources, you have scarce number of people and hours and finances and everything else. How are you going to achieve the ministry of what you feel called to do? How are we going to, do that practically? And some might say, oh, well, trust God. God will take care of everything. Absolutely. Totally agree with that. And that was true for Nehemiah. And at the same time, what Nehemiah did was he gave such a detailed accounting that you could also see practically what he did to make sure he was doing his part to make it all happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Nehemiah Way is really built on that idea of you're not just pushing work down, you're really identifying people in the church who, we talk about, Amy Lynch, the other author of the book, talks in, some of the things that she's done recently about, it's, we can call those that show up every week and they're very capable, competent, wonderful people, but they show up for Sunday morning and they're there for the service and then they leave. And, she likes to call them pew potatoes. She's like, they're not bad people. They're really great, but
potatoes are delicious. Yes.
right. It's like, but not engaged or mobilized.
Right.
And,
everybody understands that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the thing. I think a lot of times, you'll read about someone say, you need to, get you have a volunteer problem. You don't have enough volunteers. Where, what we've really unpacked in this is it's not a volunteer problem. It's a mobilization problem. Like, how do we identify, equip and activate mission mobilizers? How do we help them go from pew potato to mission mobilizer?
Mm-hmm.
And, in most churches, the people sitting there, they may be, senior executives, or they may be, directors of people. They may be project managers, program managers. They may be, business development people that engage regularly with others. You probably have a lot more leadership capacity and capability than you might realize. And, if you really believe, as I do, that God calls us to, it's like our vocation is our mission, is our ministry. It's like the skills we're getting is like part of, how he's calling us. And so, this is where the opportunity to help people like take that step forward in, just really being more engaged, and as opposed to just a consumer mentality about, I go to church, I receive some teaching, I receive some fellowship, maybe some prayer, but then go on with life. It's like, bringing those two out, really all of life together in that way.
Yeah, and it reminds me a little bit about the analogy of the consumeristic nature of church in comparison to people being actually proactively involved is been compared to a grocer, like a relationship you have with your grocer. Like if you go to a grocery store and they have good deals, you might be able to know the staff who works there and the same clerk that checks you out, and you're friendly with them. But if you find someone with better deals, you're going to go to that other place because your relationship with your grocer is a business relationship. It's a
Right.
consumeristic relationship. But if you're involved with the church, it's not supposed to be like that. It's not supposed to be like, hey, if I find a better church service or better worship music or better preaching, I'm going to go elsewhere. That's not the call that we have to the body of Christ. We have a call that's much, much deeper than that. And that's one of the things I appreciate about what you and Amy have written in this book. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe how you went from this idea of mobilizing leaders to actually putting ideas on paper and then structuring out the book, and then you and Amy partnering together to actually create it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really an interesting part of the story. It's just seeing the different elements coming together. So, we talked a little bit about, Jason really asking, commissioning this leadership development workshop series. And at the time, Amy and I are both entrepreneurs. We've done a number of collaborative projects together, and I reached out and said, hey, I'm going to do this workshop series, and, I have all this content from before that I'm going to really organize in this way. There might be a book here. It was literally the way I presented it to her.
Okay.
I said, what do you think about partnering on it? And she's like, I love it. And it's, so pertinent to what you do. And we even said at the time, like, it may just be that this is like, we capture this in a way that it becomes a resource to those in our church. It wasn't necessarily like, we're going to partner with the Gospel Centered Discipleship to publish this and all these kinds of things. It was, at this point, it might be just a resource for our own church. And so she came to every workshop session. She recorded them. She was taking notes. Each week we were kind of talking through like what was happening and what were, maybe, some things that could be tweaked for the future or that would be useful for others. And so in a sense, there was sort of an intentional effort as we were doing it to capture what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And Amy was even interviewing the people who were taking the class and getting their stories. In the book, we share a story of, Matt Davis and just the way he was really affected by it and energized by it. He was one at the beginning. He's like, because I asked the question at the beginning, what do you think the book of Nehemiah is about? And he confessed, he's like, I don't even know. He's like, I've been a believer for years. And he's like, I've never read that one. It just,
Wall, maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Right. Well, and it's funny because everybody else said The Wall.
Yeah.
Which is great. I was kind of setting everybody up because I'm always like, it's not about the wall.
Yeah.
And so that was, so, we're able to like capture those stories of the individuals and the experience as well as like, what the content was. And when we had a chance at the end to just take a step back, and we're like, this was really powerful. And really, any pastor that's making the comment, I really would need to do more with leadership development. This is a very like easily and implemented way to do it. You start out with, we got, 6 weeks, we're doing a workshop. Here's a strategic problem we know is important. We don't have time to deal with, and like put it in front of everyone. And now it's like at the end of this time, as we've already wrestled with this challenge. And now we have, a dozen people that are engaged in that particular challenge.
Yeah.
And that's where like Matt's story, where he raised his hand and said, hey, I'd love to carry this forward further. And he and Jason began to work on the problem a little bit and, do more with it. And so that's where it was almost like the book, we were able to capture not just the kind of practical how-to guide for doing a series of workshops on leadership development based on Nehemiah, but it was also what that lived experience looked like, the kind of discussions we were having and the way it was actually helping people to feel more connected, to get more engaged, and really to activate as leaders.
That's great. How long did it actually take for you and Amy to write the book together?
Yeah, book writing is not for the faint of heart.
It's not.
It's like
No.
whenever I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I should write a book one day." And it's like,
You're like, good luck with that.
"Ooh, good luck."
Yeah.
Yeah. So we probably spent a year really just kind of getting clear on what it was. So we didn't just like start writing a book one day and then all of a sudden we got to, like page 200 and it's like we're done.
Mhm.
It was almost like we spent a lot of time organizing the content and just coming up with what is really the theme here? What is the outcome? And then, we prayed about it a lot. And the thinking was, there are 1,000 ways. In fact, Amy's she has a publishing company, among other things, like, with Amazon, there's like 1,000 ways you can get a book published. But we decided we weren't even going to write the book unless there's a real calling from God to write it, that it had a purpose and a place in the world, and that there was just, someone not besides us looked at it and really came to that conclusion. And so was there really a long series of relationships and engagements. It was almost amazing, like the people that God put us in contact with almost no like outreach or pushing on our part, just people that really invested time and energy with us. Jared from the Gospel Coalition, Jared Kennedy invested a lot of time with us. In fact, his team also really helping us just to think, what does the proposal look like for this? How do we structure it? And even writing some of the material together. And then, we've worked with a number of other people that are in really, Christian leadership publishing. Ultimately, though, spent a good bit of time with Jeremy Wrightball and the team. He's the executive director at Gospel Centered Discipleship. And they really poured into us and really took us from proposal and just sort of that basic idea to really writing out the chapters. I've had, from the time that we really had a clear, like, confirmed approach, we spent 6 months really leaning in writing, and then probably a year and a half getting through the publishing process, which is surprisingly involved and
Very long. Yeah.
yeah. And but then it was just kind of as that started to come to a close and we started to move towards publication date, some just really interesting opportunities presented themselves. I've had the chance to be on a few different podcasts. We were invited to do a breakout session at the Gospel Coalition Alive Together conference in 2025. So just really interesting to see, almost with not any, I guess, outward effort on our part, God really bringing things together for this to just be offered as a resource for pastors. And we've been really encouraged to see it providing value in that way.
Yeah, that's great. Well, before we get to the 4 steps to actually get started with this, I wanted to give you an opportunity also to talk about maybe some of the available resources that you have in addition to the book that could be helpful for anybody who's watching or listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and one thing we talked about, with a lot of books, you buy the book, you read the book, and it's like, okay, well, that's it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And what we wanted to do, we really wrote this book to be a practical how-to guide, and really particularly around the focus of like to do this workshop series, because really any church that does this is, if nothing else, you get a dozen people to spend a few hours a week for 6 weeks thinking about one of your toughest challenges, or maybe something that you just really feel that God's calling you to do. Some good things are going to happen from that for sure. And
Right.
just the discipleship opportunity is huge. But we also realized, in 200 pages, you can only do so much. And so we wanted to develop some resources. So one thing is, like, we have a download that's just a free download that has a mobilization diagnostic. Really helps just figure out, like, where are we at right now. I talked a little bit about the 80-20 problem at the Gospel Coalition conference, and a room full of pastors. And I said, I'm just curious, like, we talk about 20% of the people doing the work and 80% showing up to watch. I'm like, raise your hand if that resonates with you. And almost everybody in the room.
Everybody, yeah.
Yeah, right. And then I'm like, raise your hand if you think 20% would be awesome. It was like
Yeah.
almost a third of the room still put their hands up.
Yeah.
And so so that's like the mobilization diagnostic kind of gets, helps you like even think about, like, where actually are we right now?
Mm-hmm.
And then the mobilization checklist is then based on where you are, what are things practically you can do to start moving the needle forward. We also included like a daily reading guide for the book of Nehemiah. One thing that, it's just, this could be even something, if a pastor's, plan to do a sermon on it, or a sermon series, or a class, it can be a resource for those that are taking it. So there's a downloadable of those 3 resources. There's also now a YouTube channel, which you're probably watching this video on. that is, it's just there's breakdown chapter by chapter on Nehemiah. There's daily reading in audio form. There's a lot of interviews like this one with pastors or with ministry leaders that have had success or maybe facing challenges, and those are all resources that are available for free. We are moving into a phase where we're going to start to offer some hopefully very from fee perspective, very reasonable, moderate cohort, online cohort, or either courses or community type resources, and maybe workshops in the future, if there's a call for that.
Yeah, I love that there's more going on besides, like you said, just buy the book, read the book. As an author myself, like usually it's buy the book, read the book. And if you want to email me afterward, maybe you can, maybe I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that you have like this variety of resources that are available. So the conversation doesn't have to stop after you close the book and are finished with it. Yeah. So practically speaking, let's get into maybe give us the 4 steps to get started mobilizing volunteer leaders at your church. What can you say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you can imagine, I'm drawing this right out of the book of Nehemiah. And I really think there's just 4 very specific things that you can do. And if you just read the book of Nehemiah, you'll see them. And, a lot of what we try to do in the Nehemiah way is turn those into kind of practical right now things that can be done. But the first thing, Nehemiah, right out of the gate, he's faced with the problem. He encounters his brother. He hears what's happening, the plight of the people in Judah, and he's really upset by it. He's really affected. That God really weighs this on his heart, and he immediately goes to prayer. Prayer is always step 1. So that is step 1. Pray. And so if the thought in mind is, I'm a pastor or I'm a leader, an elder in my church, and I really think we need to do something about leadership development, Nehemiah gives us a perfect playbook. Pray first. In fact, all through Nehemiah, there's like whatever's going on, Nehemiah has a 2-step that he does for every time. He prays and then he acts. And that's what you see is even in chapter 1, he prays and then he acts. He gets ready to, present to the king. So that's the first thing that's always there. And I would say it can be tempting to say that's step 1, and then we move on to step 2. It's like that one carries forward to step 2, step 3, right, step 4, to forever after. And that's, one of the things I try to break down in the book. Nehemiah's prayer that you see in chapter 1 has 8 distinct components. And the last of which is supplication for aid, really asking for something from God. Mm-hmm. The first 7 are, just humbling, adoring, it's all these things that are not asking for stuff. And, I always share, very candidly, like when I pray, like I live in box 8, it's just like, I laugh. It's embarrassing, to say it because it's not the way we're supposed to be in our relationship with God. It's like, and Nehemiah really, really lays that out. So step 1, pray, it's really good. And not just say a quick prayer in a volume. There's evidence that Nehemiah was saying that prayer continuously for 5 months. Because beginning of chapter 1, you say it was a month of Chislev. Beginning of chapter 2, it says it was a month of Nisan. That's a 5-month period of time. Mm-hmm. And it's likely that Nehemiah didn't, hear from his brother, say a prayer, and then the king's like, what's up? It was, more like that was almost like a meditation. Yeah. So that is such a critical part of it, and it's a continuous part. Step 2 is invite. So this is where, we joke a bit about the pew potatoes, but I mean, I think most of us know people in our church that are highly competent, skilled, have a strong faith, and yet, just out of busyness or life circumstance, whatever, aren't as involved as they might be or could be. And so sometimes it's just the invitation, say, hey, we're doing this thing on leadership development. We see you as someone with a lot of potential to be leading in different ways within the church. We would love it if you join, just that ask. Yeah. And one thing I always encourage people to think about, so often in the church, you'll hear people talk about giving and tithe and, what is, how are we stewarding the financial resources God gives us? But most people in this day and age would rather write you a check for $200 than give you an hour of their time. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we're so busy. Mm-hmm. And it's the most scarce resource that everybody has. We have 168 hours every week. Everyone gets that many, and we never get a single one of them back. And so, it's like a lot of times you'll hear debate like, well, the Bible says, it talks about tithes. Does that mean we're supposed to give 10% of our income financially? And, is it gross? Is it net? Should we stop there? Should we start there? Like, you get into all these questions, but what's clear in scripture is we're supposed to give of our the financial resources that God's entrusted with us in some way. Time's more valuable than money in many cases. And could you imagine if everyone in a church donated 10% of their time, 16.8 hours, basically 17 hours a week?
Mm-hmm.
Quite frankly, at that point, we'd have an organization and mobilization problem.
Yeah.
All these people showed up. What do you want me to
do? Nothing to do with all of them. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So that's number 2, is invite people that, seem like they have the interest, the willingness, the bandwidth to develop as leaders in the church. And if nothing else, them getting involved could just be a discipleship opportunity, but it's also this opportunity to really set the stage for those that would step into leadership roles in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The third is equip. So step 3 is equip. And this is where things like, the workshop series that, we did at BGC and then really defined and kind of outlined and described in the book is just one practical way to equip. It's one of many. And you equip leaders in lots of different ways. Any kind of discipleship or Christian education is serving that purpose, including, Sunday morning worship, small groups, all these things. Right. But, being intentional and specific about equipping in terms of leadership development becomes a really key step. And that's where you identify leaders, you help them to contextualize their leadership. And oftentimes it helps to connect them to where God's calling them to lead in the church. And that leads to step 4, which is activate. And so, so many times what can happen is you have a Sunday school class or a workshop series or whatever you want to do. At the end of it, everybody's like, that was awesome. And then they move on to other things. So, really being intentional about activating activating that group to say, hey, why don't you take this ministry that you've now kind of developed a strategy for, and why don't you continue and carry it forward as a group? Or it could be maybe 1 or 2 people want to continue it, but the others are really looking for ways to be involved. And, maybe even having some things like, hey, here are some ministry areas that would be really helpful. I just talked to a pastor recently who was describing they have a leadership structure and an org chart with more than 50 people in it, and only 12 of them are paid staff.
Really? Wow.
And it was really amazing to hear. And I said, how did you get that started?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, when we finished planning the year ahead, we realized there were 7 ministry ideas and things that we felt like God had laid on our hearts that we just didn't have the capacity for.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, I called 7 people together in the room and just said, I'd like to just present these 7 things to you and get your input. And his thought was, if 1 or 2 of these get somebody that's engaged, that would be great. And by the end of the session, all 7 of them essentially said, I'm in.
Wow.
And I will take point. I will figure it out. And so he had 7 ministry ideas that, really he felt a calling to God for. He's like, I have no idea how I'm going to resource these. 7 people raised their hand and said, I'll own that and figure out how to make it happen. Wow. And that was the beginning of then what became this is now, a decade later, their church is just operating in a very, very different way than is typical.
Yeah. So again, let's highlight them: pray, invite, mobilize, and activate. Yeah. Super helpful, great content. Is there any other kind of final thoughts that you'd want to share about the Nehemiah Way, or maybe something that slipped your mind at some point when we were talking?
Yeah, the one thing I don't think we talked a whole lot about is the book of Nehemiah itself, and probably a big miss, because honestly, that's the most important thing we can do.
Right.
Because I've had people say like, oh, I want to read your book because I really want to, figure out how to, advance my ministry or organize a ministry or do leadership development. And I'm like, I'd love it if you read my book, please do, but read the book of Nehemiah first. It's already in your Bible. It's, it's a 58-minute read, give or take. And it's all there if you want to unpack it. And I think a lot of times people look at the book of Nehemiah and they see pages and pages of genealogies and lists of names that are hard to pronounce and those kinds of things. I literally did a daily reading where I read it as an audio. Oh, so hard to get through all the names. But I always encourage you, don't skip chapter 3. That's like the one that's really dense, but like, read it carefully, because if you read through those names, what you're seeing is he is showing you that he broke this thing up into 43 segments, and each segment had a champion, and they also had a group of people that were dedicated followers, and they each had a very specific, section of the wall to work on.
Mhm.
It was, in a sense, what you see is Nehemiah rolled out a very specific leadership structure with volunteer leaders and volunteers that were already kind of connected to each other. I call it serving circles. They were already, configured to do work together, and there was already somebody who was kind of on point with that group. Nehemiah simply identified them and activated them.
Yeah.
And so the book of Nehemiah is such a powerful resource. And especially if you don't just do the quick read, like really dig into what it's saying. There's so much symbolism and spiritual development and discipleship to be had there. But there's also just a very, very practical guide to how you can mobilize volunteer leaders in your church.
Yeah. And it's what I'm reminded of here is like how every word of God is profitable. Every word, every single word. And so I love that the genealogies, which I would skip when I was younger. Now I go back, and when it's my time to read those things, I think to myself, God took the time to include this person's name in scripture. Like, how amazing is that? God cares about the universe, but he also cares about the one. He cares about individuals. And I love that there's that specificity in scripture as much as there is like grand, sweeping narratives about the history of the world and things like that. So yeah. So read the book of Nehemiah first. It's in your Bible in the Old Testament, and then read the Nehemiah Way. It's a fantastic book. Would love for you guys to subscribe to this channel. You can like and add comments in the bottom if you have any questions. I'm sure John would love to address those if you have any. Thank you so much for being my guest today, even though I was kind of your guest at the same time. It was fun to talk to you about this and get a little bit deeper in here. I actually read this already. My endorsement's on the back. I think it's a fantastic book at Mobilizing Church to get leaders, like lots and lots of leaders involved in the mission of what your church is doing to help reach the world for Jesus.
That's awesome. Well, and Shelby, thanks so much for just having this conversation. Really appreciate the opportunity to share just kind of the backstory on the Nehemiah Way.
Yeah.
And of course, if anyone has interest in getting further, if you put a comment below, I try to respond to every single comment. Also, you can go to thenehemiahway.com for the downloadable free resource guide. And lots of other ways that we can engage. The details of that will be in the description as well.
It's great. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Shelby.